Hi class, this is Sir Alex Pasco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. Today we are going to finish talking about lesson 8, which is animal nutrition in the digestive system. In part 1, we've talked about basically the parts of the digestive system as well as different digestive systems that different types of animals has, whether you are invertebrate or vertebrate. And if you're a vertebrate, meaning you have a spinal cord or you have a backbone, are you a monogastric? Are you ruminant? Are you an avian? So depending on what kind of species you are, you have a very different set of digestive system. So today the main focus is the animal nutrition. Why is it important for us to eat? Mainly, we have discussed this, and it is really related to cellular respiration or glycolysis. If you remember, glycolysis is when we take glucose and turn it into ATP, or basically we use that glucose to create ATPs, which are necessary for us to be able to survive. Otherwise, without these ATPs, it is impossible for us and for our body to properly function, or in other words, we would die. And a lot of the nutrients that we need in order for us to survive, we mainly get from food. And that is why it is important for us to tackle a little bit about the animal nutrition. So let us start. Like I mentioned, animal diet, or basically the food that we eat, are very important source of the materials that we need in order for us to build our DNA, in order for us to replace our cells, in order for us to create ATPs. These molecules, these complex molecules that some are being synthesized by our body, but some are not. So it is important that we will be able to get them from outside sources, and that is important for our growth, maintenance of our structure, body structure, as well as reproduction. Because without these food, without these nutrients, it is impossible for us to maintain this biosynthesis, which are important for us for our growth, maintenance, and reproduction. As humans, we have to have at least a balance of fruits, vegetables, grains, and protein. So, if you have seen the food pyramid, etc., although a lot have contested the validity of food pyramid, but it is important to note that you cannot just eat, or you cannot well, how can I phrase this? You have to make sure that you have a stable amount of fruits, which when we can get a lot of our glucose, vegetables, where we can get a lot of the fibers that we need, which helps us digest as well as remove the undigested materials in our body, grains, which also again gives us a lot of glucose, which is an important source of our energy, and proteins, because that's when we get the nucleotides, those nitrogen, in order for us to build our DNA. So it is important for us to have a balanced diet. So what do we get from eating? Well, we get what we call the organic precursors. We call them precursors because we use them as our base compounds, or our base chemicals, in order to create important various chemicals in our body. For example, carbohydrates. Carbohydrates is the primary source of organic carbons. Also, this organic carbons is what we have used to basically build our body. We are all made up of carbons. Without these carbohydrates and organic carbons, and also glucose, it is impossible for us to create ATPs. And one thing though is humans lack cellulase. Cellulase, if you guys have noticed, you would see a lot of words that will end in ase. Usually if you see these words that ends in ase, they are usually enzymes. So cellulase is an enzyme that digests cellulose. Cellulose are components or starches that you will usually find in a lot of plants. The reason that we do not eat grass, the reason that we do not eat a lot of the leaves in our surrounding, is because we do not have the important enzymes and the microflora, or the microorganisms in our gut, to be able to digest a lot of these things. which is why, if you guys remember our study on ruminants requires at least 3 to 4 stomach to be able to digest those cellulose because they're very difficult to break down. It requires a lot of enzymes and it requires a lot of microorganisms to aid in our digestion. So most of our carbohydrates does not come from cellulose because we cannot properly or we cannot quickly break down cellulose. But a lot of carbohydrates comes from grains and yeah, mostly grains, our wheat, our rice, those are our main sources of carbohydrates, which where we can get our organic carbons to create our ATPs. When we have excess sugar though, or excess carbohydrates, what happens is that it's being converted into glycogen. Glycogen is actually a very important part of our body. It's usually stored in our livers and our skeletal system, and they are the main source of they are very good main source of energy when we want to have those high burst activity. So for example, if you suddenly run, your body will usually take energy from the stored glycogen on your skeletal muscles, or sometimes the glycogen on your liver. However, if we keep eating too much sugar, we will have excess glycogen. And what happens to that excess glycogen is they become fats. And this is the fats that you usually see on obese people or much bigger people, and these fats are actually for insulation. It keeps your body warm, but also they are just excess glycogens, excess storage of energy that is not being used. Next, we have another precursor, the nitrogen. Nitrogen, we usually get them from proteins when we catabolize protein, and these are very important in order for us to build the organic molecules that are important for us to be alive, such as our DNA. And then we also have our amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, which we can also get nitrogen from. So a lot of the amino acids we actually do not make in our body. There are 20 amino acids, only 11 we make in our body. The rest, the 9, we have to consume other materials in order to get those amino acids. And yeah, so I've mentioned this. Fats are also important part of energy source because they are important parts of energy source because basically fats is a glycogen, which are excess sugar, excess glucose that could be used for high burst activities. And also we have to use fat in actually to be able to use vitamins, is more specifically the fat soluble vitamins. There are two types of vitamins, water soluble and fat soluble. Soluble meaning be able to dissolve, meaning we cannot actually be able to absorb the vitamins into our body without having fats in our body. So that's basically the various organic molecules that we can get or we have to get from eating in order to create very important processes in our body. So having said that, let's talk about the nutrition that we eat. So essential nutrients are basically the nutrients that we cannot be obtained unless we have to eat them. So there are various types of essential nutrients, which can be vitamins, minerals, etc. I'm not gonna show you the list of tables of various vitamins and minerals that we cannot create in our body, but have to get them from other sources. That is on your module, so just check on your module. But let's discuss individually what they are. We have vitamins, or in general, first we have vitamins. Vitamins, although we require them in very small amount of number, they have actually a lot of uses. And more specifically, their use is to help the enzyme function. If you remember, we have a lot of enzymes in our body, and enzymes are very important catalyst in order for a lot of the chemical processes or chemical reactions happen in our body. That's why we call vitamins coenzymes, because they help enzymes function. So they are co-partner or partner with enzymes. And then we have minerals, which helps us build in our structure and a lot of regulation in our body, such as growth factors. So growth factors helps us in structure form, helps us grow, help us create the structure of the body that we have, and we need minerals in order for us to do that. That's why we actually also call minerals as cofactors. So they help a lot of the molecules that we usually call factors in order for them to function. And then we also have amino acids. Like I mentioned, the body can only make 11 out of the 20 important amino acids. The rest should come from the food. And this is important because our body has to maintain homeostasis. If you guys remember our discussion from lesson 7, homeostasis is basically the balance, the internal balance in our body. If our body's temperature is too high, our body will pull it down. If our temperature is too low, it will pull it up. We have to be at a normal range in order for us to survive. And a lot of the heat that we get in our body to maintain our homeostasis comes from metabolism. I pronounced that funny. Metabolism. And metabolism is very related to the amount of energy we intake in our body, or more specifically, amount of energy we intake or the amount of food we intake. For example, a gram of fat is actually about 9 kilocalories, and we use that fat to maintain homeostasis in our body. So that's one important thing about eating. We have to be able to maintain our homeostasis, and in order for us to have that, we have to keep our metabolism proper, and metabolism requires energy intake via food. The other thing is when we have to create ATPs, or when we take the carbohydrates, break them down into glucose, which then be used via glycolysis or cellular respiration to create ATPs. And ATPs has energies from the peptide bonding that is on the 3 ATPs found on ATP, or 3 phosphate group that is found on ATPs. When you break those ester bonds, energy is released, ATP becomes ADP, and the whole process repeats itself to create ATP. So this energy bonds that is stored on the ester bonds, or the energy stored on the ester bonds, is what propels a lot of the function in our body. You're able to breathe, you're able to blink, breathe, walk, talk, because of the continual use of the energy stored on those ester bonds. We talk about glycolysis and we talk about glycogen. So those are the important things and the main reasons why we have to eat food. Now let's talk about where do these vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and various nutrients, where are they being digested in our body? Before we talk about that, let's talk about the 4 different processes in our digestive system. We have ingestion, where we take food into our mouth. And then we have part of ingestion, mastication, is when we chew. Not every organisms chew. Avians do not have teeth, so their digestive system is created in such a way that they'll be able to grind a lot of the things that they ingest in their digestive parts. If you guys remember, they have the pouch, and then they have the preventiculus, and then they have the gizzard, and the gizzard is the grinding part. But for us as humans, we can masticate, which is chewing, which we can start to mechanically break down the food that we eat. And then from ingestion, it goes into digestion and absorption. So most of the digestion, more specifically proteins, actually happens, lipids, and carbohydrates actually most happen in our stomach and in our small intestines. And then we have elimination or egestion, which is the undigested food molecules is expelled in our body. So it's stored in our rectum, and when it becomes full, the sphincter opens and we can actually remove those undigested undigested food. So that is elimination and egestion. And then there's actually another part of the digestive system process that is actually very helpful, called emesis. Emesis is the forceful vomiting. Please do not confuse it with those who have bulimic or those who have bulimia. I believe if it is bulimia, or in they binge eat and binge purge, meaning they eat a lot and then they vomit everything. That is a type of mental illness, and it is one of the deadliest mental illness alongside anorexia. Those two are very dangerous mental illnesses and has to be taken seriously. So please, if you know anyone that is doing this, encourage them to seek help, but do not insult them. Okay, but that emesis is different than that. Vomiting happens, specifically emesis is when we ingest materials that may be dangerous in our body, such as food poisoning. The reason that your body starts to vomit a lot of things when you were food poisoned, I don't know if you have experienced it. I have not, but I know that those people who have eaten something bad, they start to vomit. The reason for that is that your body is rejecting it because it contains perhaps very dangerous bacteria that can make you sick. So your body is reacting to remove everything that is already inside your body. So that is emesis. Now let's talk about the different molecules that we ingest and where do they break down. Beginning with the carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, it starts to break down in the mouth. That is because we have the amylase. If you remember, amylase is the saliva enzymes which breaks down starches into disaccharides, more specifically maltose. While you are chewing, the saliva which contains amylase is already breaking down the starches on your mouth. And when you swallow, not a lot of digestion is happening on the stomach. What continues the digestion of carbohydrates then is when it enters the duodenum. So from your esophagus to your stomach, and then it enters the duodenum via the pyloric sphincter. And then on the duodenum, if you remember, one small portions of the chyme. If you remember what the chyme is, that is the partially digested food on your stomach after all the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin has activated on it. And then the pyloric sphincter slowly pushes small parts of the chyme into your duodenum, and then on the duodenum, that is when you will find a lot of enzymes again, more specifically the pancreatic enzymes, the liver enzymes, and the gallbladder enzymes. And these enzymes can start to break down the disaccharides and break them into monosaccharides. And the enzymes that you will find in there are called the maltases, sucrases, and the lactases. Maltases are enzymes that breaks down maltose into glucose. Sucrases are the enzymes that break down sucrose or the table sugar, which is a disaccharide, and break it down into glucose and to fructose. Fructose being fruit sugar. And then you have your lactases, which are enzymes on your body that breaks down lactose. Lactose is milk sugar, and it breaks down lactose into glucose and galactose. Galactose is the sugar present in your milk. Basically, that's it. So these are the enzymes that is present on the duodenum, more specifically, basically the small intestines overall, that helps break down carbohydrates into monosaccharides. And now that we can see we have our glucose, this glucose then will be absorbed on the lining of our small intestines and will be used by our cells to create ATPs. So the whole cellular respiration happens. Next, let's talk about proteins. Where are the proteins digested? Proteins digestion starts in the stomach. The reason that it does not start in the tongue or in the mouth is because we do not have the enzymes necessary to break down the proteins in our mouth. So the breaking down process happens when the food enters the stomach. So it is now a bolus. Remember, bolus is the chewed food. So you put food in your mouth, you chew it, that food becomes bolus. So that bolus is the mixture of all the food that you've eaten on your mouth mixed with your saliva, and then you swallow it into your esophagus via the peristaltic movement. That contraction pushes that bolus into the stomach, and as soon as it enters the stomach, I hope you remember our discussion in part 1, pepsin, which is the enzyme necessary, will then be released. They are released by the chief cells in form of pepsinogen, and that pepsinogen is the deactivated pepsin and it is activated when it encounters other already activated pepsin on your stomach. So the pepsinogen becomes pepsin, and also when that pepsinogen makes contact with the hydrochloric acid, it is activated to pepsin, and then the pepsin will now start to break down the proteins found on your bolus, and slowly that bolus becomes chyme. I hope you I hope it's clear so far. Next, after the pepsin starts to break down the proteins into peptides. So peptides are the chains that creates our proteins. Then from our stomach, it moves back into, not back, moves into the small intestine, and then on the duodenum part and on the small intestine parts, other enzymes called the trypsin, elastase, and chymotrypsin, which are released by the pancreas, it starts to break down the peptides that are already broken down from the proteins via pepsin, and break these peptides into smaller peptides. Right? So that is what is happening. And then lastly, these peptides are now breaking down into these smaller, more individual parts of the chain. Remember, peptide is a chain of amino acids. So if you break those singular part of the chain, you will get an amino acid. So the peptides are breaking down by peptidases. We have different peptidases, and it breaks peptides into amino acids. Now we can have the amino acids, more specifically the amino acids that we cannot make. And there's actually a list of those amino acids that we cannot make in our body on your module. I'm not going to show it here anymore. There are different types of peptidases. We have the carboxypeptidases, which is also secreted by the pancreas. We have dipeptidases and aminopeptidases. So these three peptidases are the ones breaking down peptides into the individual amino acids. Next, let's talk about how lipids are digested in our body. The digestion of lipids starts in the stomach, more specifically with the lingual and the gastric lipase. But most of the digestion happens in the small intestine via the pancreatic lipase. The reason for that is because in the small intestines we have the bile. Bile is a very important enzyme that is released by the liver, remember that, but it is stored in the gallbladder. The reason that we need this bile is because we need emulsification of these lipids. Let's remind ourselves what is emulsification. Emulsification is basically breaking down a large fat globule and turning them into much more smaller globules. You can think of this as oil in the water. If you drop oil in the water, you would see that the oil will form a circle or a bubble. And then what you do is, if you stir that glass of water, that bubble starts to break down. And as you keep stirring it, it will break down into more smaller pieces. That's what bile do. It has bile salts that helps create this, what we call micelles. And the reason that you want to do that is because your body cannot actually absorb this large globule without creating them into micelle first. So lipids are made up of various triglycerides. So this is one way to break down the triglycerides, right? So what happens is that after creating the micelles, the small intestines now will be able to absorb that. And as it absorbs in the cells in our lining of our stomach, those micelles are turned from being a monoglyceride back into triglyceride. And then from triglyceride, it combines with other molecules to create what we call the chylomicrons, which then will be transported in the hepatic lymph veins, which will then be absorbed in our bloodstream. So that is how we can use and dissolve and digest lipids. So that is the process. And then lastly, where are the vitamins digested? Well, it depends whether the vitamins is water soluble or lipid soluble. If the vitamins is water soluble, it can easily be absorbed into the bloodstream. While if it is lipid soluble, it needs first to be dissolved by lipid and then be absorbed in our body via the same process. These lipids are combined because this chylomicrons contains the vitamins that you need in order for your body to help the enzyme functions. Remember, the vitamins are coenzymes. So these are where the carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and vitamins are digested and how they are digested and absorbed in our body. Let's talk about the digestive system regulation. What controls the digestive system? Well, it is controlled either by the neural network or via hormonal network. Let's talk about first the neural response. One of the earliest or one of the easiest neural response that you will see in your digestive system is salivation. Kung na-experience nyo na maglaway dahil doon sa pagkain, for example, nakaamoy kayo ng pagkain or you saw a food or even thought a food that you miss, you start to salivate. It doesn't necessarily mean that the saliva would run out of your mouth. What we mean by salivation is that the salivary glands on your mouth will start to produce more saliva. So if there's too much saliva, yeah, perhaps your mouth or the saliva will run out of your mouth, but most of the time that's not what's happening. When we talk about salivation, we're just talking about the salivary glands, the one on your parotid glands, the one on your sublingual, and the one on your submandibular starts to produce the saliva, and that is a response from the neural response on your brain. So when you smell it, your brain signals to your salivary glands to start releasing saliva in preparation for you to eat. Moreover, when this happens, your stomach also starts to produce hydrochloric acid. Your stomach is not always full of hydrochloric acid. Sometimes it lowers the pH on your stomach as to avoid, the constant high acidity in your stomach, because if you're not digesting anything, you do not need that high level of concentration of acid in your stomach. But when you see food, smell food, especially if you have fasted, you haven't eaten anything, and then you saw food, you smell it, then you start to maglaway, your stomach is also starting to produce hydrochloric acid, and your brain will start to prepare the rest of your organs, more specifically the esophagus and the other organs for digestion, to prepare for eating. And then when you've eaten and when you feel full, your brain actually signals satiety. Satiety is the feeling of being full. So busog, that's basically what satiety is. And there's a whole process on how this happens. One of the process is the expansion of your stomach. So after eating, remember, the stomach can expand up to 20 times its size, but more generally, as you eat, your stomach starts to expand, and after expanding a certain size, that expansion will then trigger a signal onto your brain to tell your brain, oh, I'm full, busog na ako. So that's how you feel satisfaction, or that's how you feel full already and know that you do not want to eat anymore. And during this whole process of neural response, there are basically three processes of the digestive phases. So these are the phases that happens during the whole digestive system. The first one is called the cephalic phase. This is the salivation phase, and this is the time where your salivary glands release those saliva and your stomach release the gastric juices. And this cephalic phase is actually signaled or stimulated by the neural system. So this is all about neurons. And then we have the gastric phase, which is when the food is finally inside your stomach. In here, what happens is that the gastric phases is stimulated by the distension of the stomach, so meaning it starts to expand, and then there is a decrease in pH because when food enters the stomach, of course the pH in your body will then decrease because there is material in there, and in the presence of undigested food. So this gastric phases is actually stimulated via both the neural and the hormonal parts of your body. And then lastly, we have the intestinal phase, wherein when the food, or basically the chyme at this point, enters the duodenum. So why are these phases important? Because these tells you a lot, basically a lot of the reason why your body, or why the organs in your body does what it does. So when the food or the chyme enters your duodenum, the reason that the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver starts to release those enzymes is because of, during the intestinal phase, the hormones and the neurons in your body signals for those organs to start to release the enzyme. The same is true for in the gastric phase. And later would yeah, so that's what's happening. And then we have the hormonal response. Of examples of hormonal response, which is in the gastric phase, is and the stomach acidity in your environment. G cells will release gastrin, which will then stimulates the release of HCl. So you have the release of hydro ions, and the chlorine ion is stimulated by a hormone called a gastrin, and gastrin is released by G cells. This happens on the gastric phase. So as soon as the bolus enters the stomach, the G cells will then tell your body to release gastrin, and the gastrin will stimulate the release of HCl on your body. And when the food is fully digested, you do not have any more undigested food on your body, your another hormone called the somatostatin will then stop the release of HCl, because we do not need that high level of acidity in our stomach if we are not digesting anything. And then we have secretine, which stimulates the pancreas. So during this is the intestinal phase. When the chyme enters the duodenum, secretine will then stimulate the pancreas to release the enzymes, the enzyme we've talked about to digest what was being digested, small intestine, basically everything. So the amylase, you still have amylase also in the pancreas, and other enzymes in your body. Your pancreas release all of those because of secretine. And then you have CCK, which stimulates the gallbladder to release the bile, because bile is being released on your food when the food enters your duodenum. So these are all hormonal. And then lastly, we have the gastric inhibitory peptide, which slows down the peristaltic movement of your stomach and your intestine. You need this specifically on peptides, on proteins, because it takes a lot of time to break down proteins. So you have to slow down the movement of the peristalsis. The peristalsis is not only happening in the esophagus, it is also happening in the stomach, which pushes the food down on the lining of your small intestine and down up on the colon. All of those are being manipulated by the peristaltic movement, and if there's peptides or proteins present, we want to digest them properly, so it slows down those peristaltic movement, it slows down the contraction, which slows down the progress of the food down on your small intestine and your large intestines, allowing it to digest fully. So those are the digestive system regulation, those are the hormonals and neural response in your body. We've also talked about which part of the digestive system, these carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and vitamins are digested, and we've also talked about why food is important. I hope everything is clear. If you guys have any question, please do not hesitate to message. Thank you so much and have a great day.